Okay, so my name is Gits Crazy Boy. I'm sitting here with Russ Diabo from Ganawage. He's your Mohawk, correct?
That's correct.
If there's, if you could tell us just a bit of who you are and what work you have done.
Well, I'm a member of
That's
the Mohawk
correct.
Nation of
If
Ganawage.
there's,
I didn't grow up there, but I did live there off and on while I was growing up. At one point, I was a museum development coordinator in Ganawage at the Cultural Center. Um, I was as a teenager, I was active. That's when I started to get active politically. I was at the takeover of the BIA building in Washington, D.C. in 1972 when the American Indian movement took it over. I hitchhiked down there after it had already started. I was at Wounded Knee in 1973 for a time. I also hitchhiked there after it started and was there for at least a week inside and a week in Porcupine, South Dakota on the reservation before I left back for home. And while I was in Wounded Knee, they were shooting 50 caliber machine guns, shooting up flares at night, shooting 50 caliber machine guns into the village. So it was a warlike experience, something I haven't forgotten. I was a high school dropout at the time, and that basically prompted me to get my high school equivalency and go back to school. So I went to college, taking Native Studies programs at Manitou College in Quebec, which is no longer there. Navajo Community College on the Navajo Reservation, which is now called Dene College. Um, University of California at Berkeley, I took Native American Studies there. And then I wound up going to Trent University, taking Native Studies there, and finally getting a bachelor's from the Native Studies Department at Laurentian University. And then I did a year of graduate studies at University of Arizona in Tucson, studying with the late Vine Deloria Jr., famous lawyer and thinker on the American side, author. And then I came back to Canada and did some graduate work at the Carleton University, specializing in Northern and Native Studies. But I never finished my master's. I wound up getting involved in doing work with a community called the Algonquins of Barrier Lake. And then I got involved with the Liberal Party. In 1990, I helped create the Aboriginal Peoples Commission of the Liberal Party of Canada in Calgary. There was a Liberal leadership convention there, and they during that meeting, they amended their constitution to create the Aboriginal Commission. And that's the same week that Elijah Harper ended the Meech Lake Accord. And a few weeks later, on July 11th, 1990, that's when there was a shootout in Gunnisatagi, and an SQ officer was killed in a crossfire, and that led to a 78-day standoff. So that kind of kicked off the Aboriginal Commission's involvement in political activities that year. But through that Liberal experience, I was vice president of policy for that commission from 1990 to 94. And in 1993, I was involved in working on the Red Book, which was the Liberal Party's platform for the election in 1993. So I have, experience in that. And after that experience, I went to work. I worked at AFN several times, once when it was a National Indian Brotherhood. In 1981, I worked as a summer student in parliamentary liaison when the Constitution was being patriated, the 1982 Constitution. I learned how Parliament worked. Part of my job was to help keep report cards on senators and MPs and how they were voting and talking about status Indian issues. I learned how laws were made through Parliament and the Senate. Then I came back and worked at AFN again when David Henneke was national chief in a part of the AFN called the Bilateral Commission, Bilateral Directorate, which was separate from the constitutional talks that were going on in the 1980s. It was representing the chiefs who were looking at the historic relationship between the federal government and Indigenous nations. From like the two-row wampum to the treaties, the historic treaties. So I've had a lot of interesting jobs and experiences that all contributed to my current, activity of being a policy analyst. Because I've seen the new Constitution get developed. I've been involved seeing how the Liberal Party operates in opposition and forming a majority government. I wound up, going to work for Ovid McCurdy in 1996 as an Indian Act Amendments coordinator, where we recommended to the chiefs after analyzing the package that it be rejected. And the chiefs agreed with us. We said it was worse than the status quo, and they rejected it. And we launched a campaign against it. And that package died when they called a new election in 1997. And Ovid wound up burning the Red Book with us supporting him. Several of us that were some of the founding executive members of the Aboriginal Liberal Commission joined Ovid in 1996 in Ottawa, and he burned the Red Book. And we agreed with him, saying that, Jean Chrétien had betrayed us. And so we supported Ovid burning the Red Book because we said the Liberals had broken their promises. And I haven't had anything to do with any political party since then. I think change is only going to come from the outside after the experiences I went through with the Liberal Party. Which is why, I understand how the Liberals think. I was a Liberal insider from that experience, for the 4 years. And that was why I was skeptical of Justin Trudeau in 2015 when he was elected.
So just before we get to that, I got to know, do you celebrate Canada Day?
No, Canada's a stolen country, and they're still committing genocide against us, and racism and colonialism. These things aren't in the past; they're happening today. So I don't think there's anything to celebrate.
What examples do you have, or that immediately come to mind when you talk about genocide? Committing genocide.
Well, I don't use that term lightly. The reason why I use that term is because the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls Inquiry last year, in their final report, concluded that Canada was committing a form of genocide through its policies by breaking up Indigenous families, and not just, our communities and nations. And that was after, interviewing the survivors of murdered and missing Indigenous women and girls, that they concluded that. That, I remember last year, in June of last year, when the report came out, the final report came out, and they said that Canada was committing genocide, the mainstream media focused on that and ignored the recommendations of the report. And the inquiry, the commissioners had to put out a supplemental report documenting, the application of genocide in Canada. And Canada was supposed to do an action plan to respond to those recommendations this June. And they said, oh, well, it's delayed because of the pandemic. So that's why I use the word genocide, is because it's been documented by, a major federal inquiry and given to Canada. And then Canada's trying to sweep it under the rug like they've done with the previous, reports and studies, like the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples from 1996, for example.
You see, this is interesting because it leads into my next question. You've often talked to me about Canada's assimilation policy. What does that look like?
Well, actually, I call it a termination policy.
Termination policy. Thank you.
Or a plan. I say it's a plan, a termination plan. But it does involve assimilation. Basically, the Indian Act was the first part of the Canada's termination plan, because the purpose of the Indian Act, it had two purposes. One was to kind of protect Indians from the settlers until the Indians could be assimilated into, the rest of Canada as generally a Canadian. I mean, now there was a section of the Indian Act called enfranchisement. So the whole purpose of the Indian Act was to train Indians on how to become Canadian citizens. And once you were deemed to be fit for Canadian citizenship by the local Indian agent, your Indian status was taken away and you were considered, a Canadian. That was the whole purpose of the Act, because under the Act, the minister and the department control all the decisions of the bans and on reserve. They have the discretion. Even today, the Indian Act is still in place. It's the main statute or law that's used to control and manage status Indians, particularly on reserve.
And when you say become Canadians, become Canadian citizens, the creation of the Indian Act, did that create us and classify us as second-class citizens?
Well, Indians were somebody other than a person. Indians were not a person in law. So if you were an Indian, you weren't a person. In a lot of ways, it was like women. Women weren't persons until 1930. There was the persons case in Canada, and then they had the right to vote and be recognized as a person. But up until that point, women were treated like Indians. They weren't people in law. And Indians started to become Canadian citizens for certain purposes. For example, in 1960, John Diefenbaker granted the right to vote to status Indians. In some provinces, it didn't happen until 1968, I think, like in Quebec. But then they started, saying that Indians were citizens for some purposes, but they were still set aside. There was legal distinctions. Mm-hmm. So, and like I said, because the government treats Indians as wards of the government, basically, right? So if you're an Indian, the minister decides. The minister, I forget what section it is, the minister could declare you mentally incompetent.
Wow.
And I think that section might still be in the Act. But the minister and the department control estates. If you have property on reserve, like a certificate of possession, and you don't leave a will, well, the department can get involved and it becomes a real administrative problem, because they're the ones that ultimately decide any of your heirs or successors may get the property.
This is on res.
On the res.
So
off the res, they don't really have any control, because most of the Indian Act applies to the reserves.
Yeah.
And the idea was my view is there's an unwritten policy of Canada. I don't believe they've written it down, but I believe that the reason why they haven't funded on reserve development, like housing, new schools and all of that, is to encourage off reserve migration into the cities and the towns. Mm-hmm. Because once you leave the reserve, then the federal government considers you to be, a resident of the province, and you're their problem. They have to pay for social assistance and that if you're not living on reserve. And I think that's a conscious plan. Because even in the United States, they actually had what they called a relocation program, where they were paying for one-way bus tickets for Indians, Native Americans, they say down there, to go into the major cities and get vocational training. And then they'd be stuck in the cities because they didn't have the money to get back to their reservations. And that was part of a conscious federal plan to assimilate the Native American tribes down there, to get them to move from reservations into the cities. I think Canada has pursued an unwritten approach here of encouraging that by not having opportunities on reserve and forcing people to leave the reserve for educational or employment opportunities. And often many of our people wind up in the cities and the ghettos and that, because they don't have the skills, and the racism, the discrimination, don't allow them to get the kind of jobs that other people are getting. So, you see that right across the country, certainly across the prairies. I've seen that, but it's a phenomenon that's happening across the country. And I blame it on the Indian Act, because the Indian Act is what controls our choices. It says what we can and can't do on reserve. And generations of that have affected our families, my family, probably your family, because it affected their choices. Even enfranchising people, they only amended the membership sections of and the registration sections of the Indian Act under what they call Bill C-31 in 1985. And that's where they reinstated a lot of people who lost their status through different means. they reinstated them as status Indians. Because the Indian agents were removing Indian status if you became part of the clergy, if you got a post-secondary degree, if you went into the military service. Um, for those reasons, they figured, well, you were fit for citizenship, so you didn't need to be an Indian anymore. And they took out that enfranchisement section in the 1985 amendments.
But it was running until 85.
Yeah, 85. It was up. It was there until 1985.
So we had generations and generations of people that were losing their status because of this.
Especially the women, right? Because there was Section 12(1)(b) that said any status Indian woman that married a status Indian man, her and her children would lose status. But any status Indian male who married a non-native woman, she got status, and so did the children. Because that was part of the social engineering. The government wanted Indian men to marry, white women and raise the children in the language and culture of the mother.
The original teaching.
And they wanted the Indian women who married out non-status to lose their status, because the whole objective was to get rid of status Indians over time, right? Mm-hmm. And so they had different measures. The Indian Act was the main instrument they used to do it. But, also economics. Because they controlled us on a reserve system and open up our traditional lands to non-natives to occupy and settle and to enrich themselves on. Anytime we tried to do something economically that competed, they shut us down. I'll give you an example. In Kahnawake in the 1830s, this historian had sent me this historical report. And I tell this to people at home, in there was a report of the French-speaking Quebecois complaining that in the neighboring town of Chateauguay, which is, next to Kahnawake, farmers from Kahnawake were taking pig manure as fertilizer and selling it in Chateauguay in the market at a lower rate than the Quebecois were. And they were complaining to the colonial officials, asking them to stop the Mohawk farmers from being able to leave the reserve to go and sell that pig manure in the market in Chateauguay, for fertilizer. Mm-hmm. And so, that's what I tell people at home. The government's complaining about us selling tobacco or cigarettes now because they're not getting their taxes. I said, they don't even want us to sell shit. And, and that was in the 1830s. So that's an example of the economic competition, that the non-natives around Kahnawake didn't want. The other ones are the Indians around my wife's reserve, Muscopeting in Treaty 4, Capel Valley. They were becoming good farmers. And the white farmers were complaining about the Indians competing in the 1800s, And the Indian agents started using the pass system on them, saying, well, you can't go to this agricultural fair. We're not giving you a pass. And that's when, they were going there to these agricultural fairs to learn about seeds. And that's when farming was becoming more mechanized. So the men had to do it, right? Mm-hmm. Because, you had to be stronger to operate that machinery. That's when in the 1800s this was happening. So once they wouldn't let the Indians leave the reserve through the passes, they gave up on the farming. And a lot of what happened is one of my in-laws told me, we entered into buckshe leases, he said, where we just shook hands with the white farmer and said, you can farm this part of my land on the reserve, and then when you harvest it, I'll get my cut then, right? And they kept, the band office and Indian Affairs out of it, because under the Indian Act, the minister gets to control any agricultural projects on reserve, whether they can be sold or not. So in order to avoid the red tape and the administration, they just didn't tell them that it was just a custom practice, right? Mm-hmm. But these are just examples of how the reserve system in the Indian Act was to keep us from competing economically with the surrounding white communities.
And there's two things I want to note. The man who wrote the definition of genocide, Raphael Lemkin, prior to World War II, he based a lot of that on us, indigenous peoples in North America, but also a lot of indigenous peoples around the world, from colonization of like the empires of Britain and France and Europe. He also had one note, which was that if you financially cripple a nation and you keep those parameters there, he wanted that to be included within genocide. And Canada was super effective at breaking down our ability to create our own economies. At the same time, hold us back and give money, give grants, give funding to these up and coming businesses, whether they were agriculture, whether they were like textiles, didn't really matter. If they were non-native, they had access to these to money. For us, within I know within the Blackfoot territory, within Treaty 7, and it might be other nations that are on the plains. But the reason why your people have a certain plot of land, why you were given that house and that part of the land, was because of the Indian agent. When we first started
Yeah.
farming and we were coming together and we were like distributing the wealth equally, they decided to break apart that and have families that were being more successful pushed away from each other, and they could only operate on this one section of land. And if they went against that, they essentially lost that part of their land.
Well, I think all Indigenous nations operated communally and collectively, as a group.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a part of the Indian Act too, was to break up, extended families into individuals, right? Communities into individuals. And that was part of the assimilation process. It was to get us to think about ourselves. Even in the United States, I remember when the Dawes Allotment Act was passed, they said we need to teach the Indian about greed because greed is at the heart of civilization. When they were breaking up tribal reservation holdings into individual holdings under this allotment scheme, where they were giving out, parcels of land to individual Indians. That's really what the objective of the Indian Act was, and is, because it's still there. We can't talk about these things in the past because, it's happening right now on July 1st, 2020.
And we don't even have an Indigenous person, an ideological Indigenous person sitting at the head of the Indian Act. Like the Minister of Aboriginal Affairs is non-native. It's crazy.
Well, I don't know if that would make a difference, right? Because if you did, and there are Indigenous people that work for the Department of Indigenous Services and probably at Crown Indigenous Relations too. There certainly were when it was called the Department of Indian Affairs, and they're part of the system, so they have to take orders from the Prime Minister's office and the Privy Council office from the top down. So they don't have any say. Their jobs are administrators to do what they're told. So it doesn't really matter what your background is. I would argue, even if they had an Indigenous person on the Supreme Court of Canada, it really wouldn't matter because the Supreme Court of Canada is in a conflict of interest because its authority is based on the doctrine of discovery. And being an Indigenous person on the highest court, the apex court of Canada, is not going to change that the source of its authority comes from planting a flag on our land and stealing it,
So do you the land the laws that the settlers had created, the colonizers had created, are they in favor of us at all in our attempts at land reclamation or getting land back or building our own economies?
Well, here's the thing. Justin Trudeau, I guess we can talk about Justin Trudeau now, right?
Yeah.
He was elected in with a majority government in 2015. And, he came in with nice promises about, a new reconciliation approach, a nation-to-nation relationship. And one of his promises, he said, we're going to fully implement the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Now, Article 26 of the UN Declaration says that lands, territories, and resources that were traditionally held by Indigenous peoples should be restored to them. Article 27 of the Declaration says there should be, a jointly developed mechanism to adjudicate those land rights. We've never had any say in Canada's land claims policies. There have been just unilateral positions imposed on us, take it or leave it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And Article 27 says if you're not going to restore the lands, territories, and resources traditionally held, then there needs to be restitution. So this restitution model that the UN Declaration has set, which are minimum standards, the UN Declaration is not legally binding, but it is an international instrument that represents minimum standards of human rights to measure Canada's treatment of us compared to, the standards that they've got in the articles of the Declaration. So if there were to be land restoration or land restitution, The provinces would have to be involved because they're sitting on our stolen lands. Um, and as my friend Art Manuel, the late Art Manuel said, if you add up all the reserve lands in Canada, it comes to 0.2% of the land base, and the rest is controlled by the provinces and the federal government. He says that's why we're poor. He used to say you don't have to be a rocket scientist to figure out why we're poor, is because they're controlling all the land. So expanding a land base to become economically viable is the key. But what's Canada's policy? Canada's policy is to eliminate reserves. They're doing it through these land claims negotiations. Even though they have an addition to reserve policy, they're making it very difficult. It has to be a legal obligation for them to return land. For example, like treaty land entitlement. If you were promised a reserve in the treaty and you didn't get the reserve, then they're only giving money and then you have to buy the lands. That's under what they call their specific claims policy. And they have given in Saskatchewan, treaty land entitlement claims have been settled. They're settling some in Manitoba now. But they're only giving money. And then, on a willing seller, willing buyer basis, the bands can buy the land and get it converted into reserve status. But really what Canada's trying to do is to get rid of reserves through, they're doing it through legislation. They have this First Nations Land Management Act that was adopted in, thinking 1999. And it's to develop land codes on reserve where you opt out of the Indian Act. As a band, you take over the liability. You're entering the treaty and fiduciary obligations. You manage the reserve lands. And then with the land code, you can start registering all the interests of native and non-native people on the reserve. Actually kind of becomes a former reserve. And then you're into zoning. And now they're working on a new law called the First Nations Private Ownership Initiative. They were working under Stephen Harper to turn reserve lands into private property. But the Trudeau government renamed it to make it sound nicer. They call it the Indigenous Land Title Initiative. But really what it is it's private property fee simple, where they want to convert reserves into being individually held lands. And the form of fee simple they're looking at is you just can't go to the bank and sell it off. Only other band members could buy it or the band can buy it back. So they're trying to keep it, as private. It's basically getting ready to merge it with the provincial system, I think. Because that was the goal of the white paper, was to get rid of reserves. But they said it had to be done in steps. So through this legislation and policies, that's what they're doing. And they've got over 300 Indian Act bands in the First Nations Land Management Act now who have developed or are developing land codes. And along with those land codes in that act, there's a First Nations Fiscal Management Act, which also has about 300 bands or so in it. And the purpose of that act is to start developing tax regimes on reserve. And a lot of the bands are going into it saying, we're going to set up tax collection for non-natives. But, once you start setting up tax collection systems on reserve, just a matter of time before they can be extended to the status Indians on reserve. Mm-hmm. Because one of the goals of the federal government is to get rid of Section 87 of the Indian Act. And that's the section of the Indian Act that says property on reserve is non-taxable. And the courts have said income on reserve is property on reserve, and therefore is non-taxable if you earn your income on reserve. Connecting factors, the courts have said. So what the government's trying to do with this Land Management Act and Fiscal Management Act is to assimilate the bands into Canada's property and tax systems.
Yeah.
Hundreds of bands are going for it because they think it's going to improve their opportunities for economic development. But, the ones that led this are the 4 bands in British Columbia who are adjacent to cities. So they can treat their reserves like real estate. Musqueam, Squamish, Kamloops, and Westbank. They're all next to big cities in British Columbia, and they're the model that to try and use that model on everybody else to treat reserves as real estate.
We had a little bit.
But you can't do that for hundreds of bands.
Can you go back? We just had it froze for a couple seconds. You said Musqueam, and then it just froze.
Musqueam, Squamish, Kamloops and West Bank are the four bands that are used as the economic model by what was the Department of Indian Affairs. And they're trying to apply that to all the hundreds of bands across Canada. But to treat your reserve as real estate doesn't really make sense for reserves that are like in rural areas or only fly-in communities. That model won't work. And I don't really think it's fair to just focus on the reserve land base and say, okay, that's your base for economic development, when lands, territories, and resources have been stolen, and we haven't even sorted out restoration of that or restitution, including maybe getting revenue sharing, from the provinces or the feds, because that could be a way of giving restitution back for lands that were illegally or improperly taken from us. But we don't talk about land rights. All the chiefs since Trudeau came in and he said, I'm going to implement the UN Declaration. What did he do? He's focused on programs. He gave $21.4 billion in new money from budget 2016 to 2019. That was all for on-reserve programs. Housing, infrastructure, getting rid of the boil water advisories, education, health, for those things. Those are important things, but that's a drop in the bucket compared to what's needed. Mm-hmm. A lot of the mainstream media think 21.4 billion is a lot of money. But when you look at the backlog of housing and all the needs and the forced underdevelopment on reserve for over a century, it's a drop in the bucket from what we need with our growing populations. And I think it's farcical. But, a lot of chiefs are going into it because half a glass is better than none, right? Mm-hmm. And Arthur Manuel, again, Art and I were very close. He was my best friend. We had, we agreed a lot on these issues. What Art said is Canadian colonialism has three phases. First phase is dispossession. And then after we were dispossessed becomes the second phase, which is dependency. And because we're dependent on those federal transfer payments, because we've been forced on these small reserves, which aren't economically viable, while everybody else enriches themselves off of our lands and territories and resources around us, right? And the third phase is oppression, because when we try to fight back against the dependency, they send in the court injunctions followed by the police. And then, as we saw 30 years ago in 1990 in my territory, the army. So, that's how the asserted crown sovereignty is enforced, is by their courts, their police, and their army. But it's all based on this doctrine of discovery. So that's why I say it's asserted crown sovereignty. In law, they have this thing called de jure or de facto. In law or in fact. And so in Canada, I would say that crown sovereignty exists de facto because they're using force to maintain their system on top of us. And that's what colonialism is. And, it really came into effect in 1867 when they brought in the British North America Act and divided powers between the federal government and the provincial governments. We weren't included in that. We were included under the federal government having exclusive legislative authority over Indians and lands reserved for Indians. Section 91, which is federal powers, subsection 24, which is Indians and Indian lands, or lands reserved for Indians. That's the constitutional authority that the federal parliament used in 1876 to pass the first Indian Act. So it came from the B&A Act, giving them their constitution, where the federal parliament passed an Indian Act over us. And now they passed other federal laws using Section 9124. They've got the First Nations Land Management Act, First Nations Fiscal Management Act, First Nations Election Act, First Nations Oil and Gas Act, and on, So they're using that constitutional authority to control and manage us. So this idea of sovereignty, there's no recognition of sovereignty. Even under the inherent right policy. I said I was a liberal from 1990 to 94 in vice president policy for the Aboriginal Liberal Commission. In the 1993 election in the Red Book, we got the government to agree in its platform that it said that a Liberal government would act on the premise that the inherent right to self-government was an existing right under Section 35 of Canada's Constitution. But in 1995, Jean Chrétien, Mr. White Paper as I call him, imposed the 1995 Aboriginal self-government policy, which basically converts Indian Act bans into municipalities because there's preconditions to the negotiations. So even though it was called the inherent right policy, it's in anything but the inherent right policy. But because they attach money to negotiate there, you've got hundreds of bands now who are negotiating under that policy, to become a municipality, or as Justin Trudeau calls it, the fourth level of government after municipalities. It's the money that drives, the band councils to go to this negotiation table or that negotiation table. And that's the dependency I'm talking about. If we had access to our lands, territories, and resources, we would be more independent to be able to make more decisions independent of Ottawa. But the other thing is the courts have started to define Aboriginal treaty rights under Section 35 of the Constitution. The first case was in 1990. It's been 30 years. Now there's been a number of Supreme Court cases that have laid out legal tests and principles that cost millions and millions of dollars to collect the evidence, the historical and cultural evidence to prove. They put the burden of proof on us. So band by band or individual, you have to have the proof. If you're asserting you have an Aboriginal right, the burden of proof is on you to prove it, or a treaty right. And you have to go by these legal tests and principles the courts laid out for Section 35 rights to prove that. And we don't have the money because most of our money comes from the federal government, and we can't just take that money and run to court and sue the federal government. So, we're in a situation where we're definitely controlled and captive, and they're trying to encourage us to move off reserve because then we become a provincial responsibility, not federal.
The money that's allocated to band, do you think that there's enough money that is given to bands to run their bands successfully, or is there not enough given?
I think it's chronically underfunded because it's the funding formula there. See, here's the thing. I'll try and break this down simple. The Trudeau government, when they came in 2015, said we have a two-track approach. One track is to deal with short-term immediate issues like getting rid of the boil water advisory, closing the gap on social and economic gaps between First Nations and Canadians. Mm-hmm. The other track is long-term changes to policy and law. So they said we got two tracks. So what those two tracks are is they came about is that they dissolved the Department of Indian Affairs. They created two ministers without consulting the people. Even AFN wasn't consulted. Harry Bellegarde admitted that. They dissolved the Department of Indian Affairs. They pointed to the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples from 1996 and said there's a recommendation that said to do this, to dissolve Indian Affairs and create two new departments. So they've got two ministers, two departments, and two fiscal policies. One track is the Minister of Indigenous Services, the Department of Indigenous Services, and funding for Indian Act bans, which they're saying will give you grants up to 10 years or less. So that's the status quo track. The other track is the Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations, the Department of Crown Indigenous Relations, and the self-government fiscal policy. So that track is for those groups that sign modern Section 35 agreements to get out of the Indian Act, either a self-government agreement or a modern treaty where you're eligible, because only certain parts of Canada are eligible, like where there aren't any land treaties. So that's British Columbia, parts of the Yukon, Northwest Territories, Quebec, and the Atlantic. Not the prairies, because there's a number of treaties there, historic treaties. So there's no modern treaties in the prairies. They're only for the areas of Canada where there's no treaties. But in the modern treaties include self-government. So for the prairies, they're saying if you want to implement your historic treaties, you have to sign a self-government agreement. And if you sign a self-government agreement, you get a fiscal policy that goes with it. And that fiscal policy is based on own source revenue, which includes taxation. So the two tracks, either you stay under the Indian Act and you're controlled by the Minister of Indigenous Services, the Department of Indigenous Services, and although you get a grant, you're not getting any new money. Even if you sign a 10-year grant, you're still getting chronically underfunded for 10 years. You're just getting kind of a block funding arrangement. They're offering you more money if you sign a self-government agreement, go into this new fiscal policy, and then you raise taxes off of people, including your own people. That's the own source revenue. So those are the two tracks that they're applying. And many of the chiefs are going into the negotiations to move out of the Indian Act into the second track. Now, they don't need the people to go into the negotiations. They'll have to come back to the people when it's time to ratify an agreement that's been reached. And that's when the people are going to be saying, we're having a vote on this, and I don't know what it means. And then the federal government's also telling the band councils who are in the negotiations, well, you only need to have a 25% threshold. You don't need all of your people. If you can get 25% of your membership to vote, for this agreement, we'll accept that. So that's what they're doing, is they're lowering. It's not 50% plus one like it should be. If it was a white community, you bet you it'd be 50% plus one. But for our communities, they're saying, oh, no, you only need 25%. We'll accept that. And then if it's challenged later in court down the road, you'll say, Your Honor, there was a referendum held. They voted, the majority voted yes, of the 25%. And also, they're funding the yes side. They don't fund the no side to develop any alternatives. And if you vote no, then they push for another vote. I can give you examples in the country where they have voted no, and they've come back to them and said, well, you need to hold another vote, and they do. So, there's a lot of pressure coming from Ottawa down onto our leadership and then onto our people, because by the time our people get to vote on something, it's been developed and negotiated with lawyers paid for by Ottawa, advisors paid for by Ottawa, and a communications plan being sold by the band council to the people saying this is the best deal we can get. That's the way it's working. But, this is complicated legal stuff. And a lot of our people, this is constitutional law. And I'd argue it's international law, because Canada is undermining international law with their domestic law. They're saying they're implementing the UN Declaration. I'll give you an example on how they're rewriting it. In 2017, Canada unilaterally issued 10 principles for Indigenous relationships. Principle 6 of those 10, you can look this up, it's online. Look up Canada's 10 principles for Indigenous relationships, you'll find it. Principle 6 says we aim to get the free, prior, informed consent of Indigenous peoples. But if you look at Article 32 of the UN Declaration, that says states shall obtain the free, prior, informed consent of Indigenous people, not aim to. It says shall. And in law, when you see shall, that means you must. Not aim to, maybe we'll get it. So, Canada's basically rewriting a Canadian version of the UN Declaration, which is not the same version that was passed by the UN General Assembly in 2007. And that's just one example. I can give you more on how they're doing it. But when they told the UN in 2016 that Canada is endorsing the UN Declaration without qualification, Carolyn Bennett, who was the minister who was telling the UN this, in her next breath said, we intend to implement it in accordance with the Canadian Constitution. So right away, there's your division of powers between the federal and provincial power. Where are we? We're underneath them and controlled and dominated by those two orders of government. And in Alberta, that's Jason Kenney's government, and then the Trudeau government. So it hasn't really worked out very well in that province for First Nations, I'd argue.
No, it's not. They just passed a law of jailing protesters.
I saw it. Yeah.
Yeah. And just
Bill 1, I think it was called, right?
They pushed it through. And it's law.
Yeah. Well, he's got the majority, right?
I got to recap a little bit here for people that are just catching up, because we covered a lot of content. One of the things that I learned from a very amazing Mohawk woman who she was on the front lines during the standoff. I can't remember her name right now.
You're talking about in 1990?
Yeah.
Are you thinking about Ellen Gabriel?
Yes, Ellen. Oh my God. Ellen had talked about a phrase, colonial enforced poverty. Colonial enforced poverty. And what we were talking about is historically right now, we've kind of laid out this map where we had government policies that prevented us, that first took away our land, that restricted us to these reservations. We talked about policies where the Indian agent would prevent us from starting an economy and growing an economy within our lands that has been going on for like generation after generation after generation. So, while like if we use the plains, while farmers were, getting grants, bursaries, and help from the government, the Indian agent prevented us from selling any of our goods to any outside nations. The Indian agent prevented us from using metal tools, prevented us from getting farm equipment, prevented us from getting loans. While this was happening, the empires, the farming empires, were starting all around us. With the Mohawk people, you couldn't even sell pig shit. They took
That's
that.
right.
And then there's they. It's like you're getting caught with narcotics. I believe has a less of a jail sentence or time spent or fines than getting caught with contraband tobacco in Canada, Mohawk tobacco. These are like we're talking about colonial forced poverty. So then there's distribution of money from the government to the bands themselves, which is chronically underfunded, which is why nations have to usually choose between picking paved roads, which a majority of us don't have because it costs a lot of money to pave and then maintain, water, um, schooling, medicine. Like, if you're receiving your funds from the government, these are the choices you have to make. Which one this year or the next couple of years is going to be underfunded? This is by design. This isn't mismanagement of funds. This is by the design from the government to us, and it's still ongoing right now. The issues we are talking about, whether they're from the 90s or the 80s or the 70s, the 2000s, they're still happening right now. This essentially is the colonial enforced poverty. That's what we've been explaining. That's what Russ has been talking about. For the people that are just trying to catch up with us, we have a few questions. We're going to get to them soon. One of the things I just wanted to point out, you talked about the First Lands Management Act, and then they're like, oh, we can start taxing all the white people. If you do that, you're opening yourself up to discrimination lawsuits because they're going to say, well, why are we getting taxed and not them? And this is going to go right to the government, provincial government, the Supreme Court. That's what's going to happen. And that is
No,
it.
no,
You don't think so? You don't think that these white people are going to
no,
be like, why are we getting
because
taxed?
these tax systems are in place already on a number of bands.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and some bands are even paying provincial tax on reserve. I know that Perry Bellegarde has a nickname from when he was head of the FSIN, the provincial organization there. He agreed to provincial taxation being applied on the reserves. So they have a nickname for him out there called PST Perry because they're paying provincial tax on reserve. Most other provinces, you're not, if goods are delivered to reserve, you don't pay the GST or the PST.
Mm-hmm.
Ontario is the only province, and it was because the Ontario Chiefs went to fight the Harper government on this and the provincial government. Ontario is the only province where you can walk in with a status card and get point of purchase sale, and the provincial tax is taken off. They have a harmonized sales tax in Ontario,
Yeah.
but the provincial sales tax is taken off, and that was because the chiefs across Ontario were threatening to block all the roads and shut the province down if they tried to enforce the harmonized sales tax on the people. So even if you're, a status Indian from Alberta and you're in Ontario and you go to a store and buy something, you can pull out your status card and they'll take the PST off.
Mm-hmm.
But that's the only province where that's happening. The rest of the provinces, you have to deliver it to the reserve, to get the GST and PST taken off.
Yeah.
Except for Saskatchewan now, they're paying the PST.
I believe honestly that comes from the confrontations that like the Mohawk people had with the government. I really think that the provincial government is afraid when we begin to assert our rights. Like, when we, because everybody that from here in Treaty 8 and then Treaty 7, um, there was so much strength that we got from seeing our people standing up, because the injustices, although they're different at some points, the oppression, the exploitation of us is still is very much the same. And so when I hear like Ontario doesn't have to pay for that, I believe it's like they've taken it to court, they've done the routes, but also Ontario knows that push comes to shove, they could have another potential Oka, they could have another like Caledonia, they could have these things happen. It's like these nations aren't afraid to stand up when push comes to shove. It's like we, at least our perception from Alberta, from Treaty 7, Treaty 8, that's it. We look at like, man, those guys don't really mess around. When it comes to push comes to shove, they're going to drop everything they're doing, and they're going toe to toe.
Certainly the Haudenosaunee communities have done that.
Yeah. Which I got a lot of love for the Haudenosaunee, man. I just, I've learned a lot when I came out there, spending time in Akwesasne, spending time in Six Nations, and just listening and learning. And one of the things I want to talk to you about really quickly, what is your thoughts on the word land claims?
Okay, that comes from Justin Trudeau's daddy, Pierre Trudeau. In 1973, the Nisga'a went to court, to the Supreme Court of Canada, arguing they had Aboriginal title. 3 of the Supreme Court justices said, yes, they have Aboriginal title. 3 of the justices said, well, if they had Aboriginal title, they lost it when BC joined Confederation. Mm-hmm. The 7th judge ruled against them on a technicality. So they lost on a technicality. Otherwise, the court was split. But that freaked out the federal government, Pierre Elliott Trudeau, who was prime minister in 1973, because they were funding huge mega projects. The James Bay Agreement, the hydro project in Quebec. They were looking at the Mackenzie Valley pipeline project, bringing a pipeline from the Mackenzie Valley down to the south, which wound up having an inquiry of Thomas Berger, right? So they freaked out. Trudeau said, well, maybe you had more rights than I thought you had, and then he announced a native claims policy. He called it a land claims policy. He said there's 2 types of land claims that we'll negotiate. There's comprehensive land claims, which are for parts of Canada, who are having that haven't had land treaties, and who are, arguing that they have Aboriginal title. And then specific claims are for lawful obligations, outstanding treaty obligations, illegal disposition of Indian lands, like, loss of reserve lands or trust funds. So they said the land claims policy is going to cover 2 kinds of land claims: comprehensive land claims and specific land claims. And the specific land claims are the ones that have mainly been applied on the prairies, the treaty land entitlement, reserve lands that we are legally taken by Indian agents or whatever. There's compensation paid for that, right? So in 1983, when they amended the 1982 Constitution, the groups who were negotiating comprehensive claims, the Grand Council of the Crees of Quebec had signed the James Bay Agreement in 1975. That was the first so-called modern treaty. And there were other groups at the table. The Nisga'a were at the negotiation table, the Council for Yukon Indians, the Dene Métis, the Inuit, the Council of Tikamek-Montagnier, the Labrador Inuit Association. So there were 6 other groups that were negotiating comprehensive claims across Canada at the time, when in 1983, when this Constitution. When the new Constitution came in, there was Section 35 that said, we hereby recognize and affirm the existing Aboriginal treaty rights of Aboriginal peoples. But there was a Section 37 in there, which said the Prime Minister has to, within 1 year of that Constitution becoming law, the Prime Minister has to hold a First Ministers' Conference on identifying and defining the meaning of Aboriginal treaty rights in Section 35 of the Constitution. And sorry, that's my wife digging around behind me there. Sure, Mercom. And And so Section 37 was supposed to have a meeting to define what Aboriginal treaty rights means in the Constitution. So in 1983, when they had that First Ministers' Conference, the issue that was talked about was René Lévesque, who didn't agree with the Constitution, let his seat be used by different women who were talking about losing their status under 12(1)(b) of the Indian Act. And that issue, ate up a lot of time. And they had a working group on the side that came back and said, okay, we're going to come up with a list of agenda items, and we're going to propose 3 more First Ministers' Conferences, one in 1984, one in 85, and the last one in 87. But they also included in that political accord is we're going to amend Section 35 of the Constitution. Mm-hmm. This is where I'm getting to the land claims part. I'm giving you the long answer. Section 35(3) of the Constitution Act Amendment of 1983 said, for greater certainty, any land claims agreement that has been settled or may be settled is a treaty within the meaning of Section 35(1) of the Constitution, which is a section that said Aboriginal treaty rights are recognized and affirmed. So they created a new category of treaties. These land claims settlements are treaties now. And so when it said any land claims agreement that has been settled, well, that brought the James Bay Agreement from 1975 under constitutional protection. And may be settled, that covered the other 6 groups who were negotiating and the ones after them, comprehensive claims. Like in the Yukon, the Council for Yukon Indians, most of them have settled their land claims. Most of the Dene Métis in the Northwest Territories have settled. The Inuit settled their land claim and also agreed to create Nunavut, a territory that was part of the negotiations around the land claim. The Council of Atikamekw-Montagnais, they call themselves the Innu Nation now, and the Atikamekw, that's a different nation. They haven't settled, The Labrador Inuit Association, they settled a comprehensive claim. So they've settled modern treaties. So now you have the historic treaties, the pre-1975 treaties, which is the prairies and elsewhere, right back to pre-Confederation, because we have treaties from 1760 and that, into what's now Quebec and the Atlantic. Those are the historic treaties. And Canada hasn't dealt with them because those are with Great Britain. But now you have these modern treaties, these land claims settlement agreements. So they elevated the word land claim from being a policy statement from 1973 to being in the Constitution in 1983, 10 years later. And now we're stuck with that term land claim. To me, I think it cheapened, the meaning of treaty when you call it a land claim. Mm-hmm. But it's in the Constitution, and now, they're getting these so-called modern treaties, these land claims agreements are, and there's been about 30 of them now. So those groups have come together and created the Land Claims Agreement Coalition. They have a website, you can see. They came together because they argued the federal government wasn't implementing their modern treaties. So they formed a lobbying group to pressure Canada to respect their treaties. And those are the groups that have developed this self-government fiscal policy, that anybody that signs a modern agreement now is going to be under that fiscal policy from these groups that are already set the precedent by compromising their Section 35 rights under these modern treaties or land claims agreements. So that's where the word land claim comes from. But it also goes to land claim settlements of specific claims, mm-hmm. Where you're getting money for settling a specific claim, like a treaty land entitlement, TLE, which is in the hundreds of millions of dollars usually. And then they have other ones like cows and plows, right, where there was promises for agricultural implements that they never provided. And so now they're figuring out what the rate of what that promise means in modern terms, and they're giving cash settlements to settle those. That's a specific claim, though.
That's like, how much do we give for historical poverty, for putting that and for like putting that on your people, like these cows and plows. That to me, it's always been like, how do we measure enforced poverty?
Some of the people vote for it because basically they are impoverished, right?
Yeah.
And that's what the government's taking advantage of, is the fact that our people are impoverished, and they're going to dangle the cash in front of them.
And the promise of cash. I think for me, the issue, for me, the word land claims, when it's to us, bothers me to a great deal because we don't have a land claim. Our validation of who we are is in our ceremony is when it's, which goes right back to creation or goes right back to the birth of our consciousness. And if you want your validation of where your people are, you'll find it with their cultural carriers. You'll find it in ceremony, and that's all we really need. We don't need like this idea of jumping through their hoops. They have their own data of when they came here. They have their own data of when they started resource extraction. We don't have that. We don't need that because we've always been here.
Well, I think I'd have to differ with you on that because, like it or not, we're faced with their justice system. And if our people want to seek justice and develop an alternative of what Ottawa's doing, I've been saying what we need to do is have self-determination plans. Mm-hmm. And Canada's thrown around the term self-determination too, but when they use it, they mean the same as their self-government policy. They're calling that self-determination, which is BS because self-determination is a international right of peoples. Mm-hmm. And Canada is really denying that because they're trying to undermine our ability to achieve that. So what's the self-determination plan? And I put this on my website. If you look at, I got my vision laid out there at russdiabo.com. Anybody can look at it. What I lay out is you have to look at your research holdings. In each band has to do this. You have to look at assessing your history, your language, your culture, how the Crown's treated you. You have to figure out the contemporary actions on your treaty lands or your traditional lands. You need GIS, computer mapping capacity to map out these interests and build your community plan based on the research and planning, the mapping, to meet the legal tests to take on the provincial and federal government and corporations. Because if you don't have the same information that the Crown governments and the industry have, they're going to crush you in court. Mm-hmm. And even if you don't want to take them to court, you're going to need it to defend yourself if you're charged, from civil proceedings, or maybe criminal proceedings. Because the burden of proof's on us. We say we have an Aboriginal treaty right that exempts us from what the province is doing or the federal government. Then we have to bring it forward. And even if we want to launch an international complaint against the province or Canada, at the human rights bodies, they're going to say, well, where's your evidence of how you've been treated by the state government? So no matter how you look at it, we do have to document who we are, where we came from, that we're the descendants of the people that have lived there for thousands of years. What's happening on our territory? What have the forestry companies done? What have the mining companies done? What have the oil and gas companies done? What's the damage that's been done? What's the current state of the environment on our traditional territory? We have to take a fact-based approach to defending not only this generation's rights, but future generations. So we need to develop skills in information management, modern information management. We need to be able to merge our traditional knowledge, our oral history, in with written history and this other forms of information to advance our rights of self-determination. But the way the system works, if we don't do that, it's only going to be the bands that do that are going to be able to successfully defend themselves and survive as distinct organized societies into the future, I'd argue. Otherwise, you're going to wind up following what Ottawa's saying, and where Ottawa leads you, the destination is to become this fourth level of government, lower than the federal, provincial, or municipal forms of government. You're at the bottom of joining confederation at the bottom as an ethnic government, and future generations will be just called Indigenous Canadians. It probably won't even matter which nation you're from, because you'll just be generically known as Indigenous, because they're taking the same approach with the Métis and the Inuit and First Nations. It's a pan-Indigenous approach that Trudeau government's implementing. So unless we stand up for ourselves and take on doing our own information management and our own plans to enforce our own self-determination, the Indian Act and everything's already done a lot of damage to us. It's going to finish us off. And if we want an antidote to colonialism, we have to create it ourselves through our families. Our families need to do that to pressure the band councils too. We should be meeting as extended families to do this and direct the council on what we want them to do. That's the first thing you need to do. You need to look at, okay, what is our band council? What negotiation tables are they at with the province and the feds? There should be transparency and accountability for what they're negotiating in our name. Not these secret tables. Like all these recognition tables and what I call termination tables, they're all secret. The only time we find out what our band council is negotiating is when they come back to us and say, oh, you're going to vote on this agreement we negotiated for you. They don't tell us along the way and what the terms and conditions are. Because these policies have preconditions. They have to go and negotiate under them. Ottawa says, okay, if you're going to negotiate, here's our preconditions. Like for self-government, trade and commerce is not included in self-government negotiations. They're only negotiating local matters. You can't negotiate sharing trade and commerce powers that the federal government has.
How much power does our current Indian Act chief and councils have to fight this? If we are like approaching them or asking for the transparency, how much leeway are they given to fight?
I think at this point, the chief and councils are basically administrators for Ottawa. Their job is to manage the discontent of the people. That's what they're paid for, basically. And to deliver the programs and services, that are chronically underfunded. So if we want change, we're going to have to create a people's movement to do it. And I've always said, I've always been an admirer of what happened in South Africa, with Stephen Biko, He led this thing called the Black Consciousness Movement. And the police killed him. They beat him to death because they were so afraid of him and what he was promoting amongst the people. But I think we need an Indigenous consciousness movement, that's based on our spirituality, our protocols, our beliefs, and tying that to a political action. We need something like that. And we have when they negotiated the residential school settlement agreement, I know a lot of the survivors didn't agree with it, but one of the things that Phil Fontaine, who negotiated that, put in there was this common experience payment for going to residential school. And the reason why that was in there is because we've all been impacted by the Indian Act. That's our common experience. It doesn't matter if we're a Mohawk or a Cree or Ojibwe or Nishka or Shuswap. We've all been impacted by the Indian Act in one way or the other. Some bands more than others. Some bands have embraced it. Some have resisted it, right? The Indian Act. The point is, coast to coast, we share that colonial experience of having the Indian Act imposed on us for generations. And so each band has kind of got to figure its own way to decolonize its way out of the Indian Act. What works out east, in Mohawk territory is not going to be the same thing in Alberta for Treaty 6, 7, and 8,
Yeah.
You guys got a different history, different geography, different fact situation. But the fact is, we all have Ottawa, oppressing us. We share that in common. And we share the provinces oppressing us. There's 10 different provinces. But each province has Section 92 powers under the BNA Act. They're using those same constitutional powers to oppress us provincially. Quebec's doing it differently than Alberta is, but they're both using Section 92 powers and doing it to us. They're saying they have the authority over natural resources, over schools, creating municipalities, all of that, So these are the things we need to be aware of, and we need to start coordinating. And we have the tools, like we're using this technology today. Growing up, I'm in my 60s now. We never had that before. Even in the 1990s, I don't even think we were really starting to use emails. We were using fax machines. That was the big technological breakthrough, was being able to fax something. Everybody was fascinated with that. But I was around when the teletypes were around, where you get that ribbon and you read what's happening. So I remember that, and that was in the 80s, Anyways, so now we have personal computers, we have social media, we have lots of technology. We just need the consciousness to get out of the Indian Act thinking and to coordinate our actions as people, as families and as communities and nations. Hold forums, to talk about what Ottawa's doing and figuring out what our alternatives are to get out of it, at the regional and local level. But we're not doing that. We count on our organizations to do the critical analysis. Like I did that, right? When I was Indian Act Amendments coordinator at AFN, when Ovid McCready was national chief, my job was to break down the Indian Act Amendment package into plain language to explain to the chiefs across the country why it was worse than the status quo and we should oppose it. So I had to explain it, technical stuff, in a way that they would understand and they would agree, and then help us fight the government and stop it from happening, to become a law.
Mm-hmm.
Our people need to do that because AFN is not doing critical analysis. Since the Trudeau government came in 2015, AFN signed 2 agreements with Canada. One on creating a new fiscal policy, which they're doing, which is going to lead to taxation, I'd argue. And the other is this joint priorities, where they're working on the Trudeau government on a national plan. And it's from the top down and in secret. And what Trudeau did was he's created what he's called these bilateral mechanisms with the 3 national Indigenous organizations, the Assembly First Nations, the Métis National Council, and the Inuit Tepariza. So each one of them has a cabinet committee, between the Trudeau cabinet and the national organization. So AFN has a bilateral mechanism, a cabinet committee, where they meet annually with the Prime Minister and they meet quarterly every 3 months with a delegation of AFN and the ministers like Carolyn Bennett and Mark Miller, the Indigenous Services Minister, who's learning Mohawk. But it's to help implement Trudeau's agenda. His government controls the pen process and the funding.
Mm-hmm.
So they're saying they're going to develop legislation when Parliament returns to implement the UN Declaration, because Romeo Saganash's bill didn't pass, Bill 262. They're saying that's going to be the floor. They're building something above that. They're going to do that jointly with the provinces, the territories, with AFN, the Métis, the Inuit. So they're going to introduce a bill and they're going to try and pass it by December of this year.
December?
December, yeah. And we see how great it's turned out in BC with them passing Bill 41 to implement the UN Declaration last November or December. To me, Premier Horgan in BC kind of turned that when he forcibly invaded and forced removal of the Wet'suwet'en off their territory in February. To me, that basically meant that, the BC government, and tacitly with the support of the Trudeau government, it meant that they turned the UN Declaration into toilet paper.
Yeah.
Because to me, when I analyze public policy, it's not just written statements or statements from the politicians. It's government actions. Government actions are part of my analysis of policy. So, for example, if they say they recognize the inherent right to self-government, and then they try to charge us, for selling tobacco, for not paying taxes and that, or cannabis, then I say that's BS. You're not recognizing the inherent right. You're not recognizing any sovereignty, internal or otherwise, of any First Nation.
I think it's they acknowledge it as we're signing our rights away. When I look at what they mean by that. Like they're like, oh yeah, we acknowledge it. We acknowledge the fact that you are signing everything to us, and that you're giving us our control.
In the inherent right policy of 1995, they recognize that the inherent right exists in an abstract sense, but not on the ground.
Yeah.
And what my buddy Art said is Trudeau's legal reconciliation technique, he said, is basically a surrender and grant back approach, where you surrender your pre-existing sovereignty and rights to Crown sovereignty, and they grant you back this lesser right in the form of, the agreement or the legislation that you're accepting. So that's what he says. It's a surrender and grant back technique.
And do you believe that applies to the modern treaties, which requires cede, release, and surrendering?
Oh yeah, it's a modification of a right. They're modifying. And in fact, in 2000, in the Claycho case, in the negotiations in the Northwest Territories, I have a cabinet document from 2000 that AFN analyzed when Matthew Puncombe was national. Paul Joff was the lawyer that analyzed it. But what they were proposing is one way to deal with their concerns about certainty and finality in these agreements, because they don't want to use extinguishment, is they said there's a non assertion technique that they'll apply. And I believe they're using that technique in BC right now with the negotiations they're doing with these modern treaties out there. Is the non assertion technique is you agree not to assert any of your constitutional rights except what's written into the agreement. And basically, it is like a surrender and grant back technique where you're surrendering to Crown sovereignty and then you're implementing delegated authority under the agreement. But, you'll be like a local ethnic government. And that's what Carolyn Bennett is saying. They have to complete the work of confederation by getting these agreements. So remember that two-track approach I said, the two ministers, the two departments, the two fiscal policies? Mm-hmm. All the Indian Act bands are in the status quo of being under the Indian Act, but they want to move everybody over to the other track of signing a modern Section 35 agreement. And they're going to use the money to coerce it because the money is what drives everything. So that fiscal policy, the 10-year grant, which is underfunded, they're going to say, if you want more money, you got to sign this modern agreement. And that's what they're going to sell to the people. And that's what I told, when I was out east talking to some of the Maliseet representatives there, I said, you know how you terminate an Indigenous nation? You do it band by band, getting them to sign agreements to eventually that nation doesn't exist anymore because it's now a collection of fourth level ethnic governments. And that's what the Trudeau government's doing. He's doing the same thing that Harper was doing, because Harper used liberal policies. Harper used the land claims policies and self-government policy of Jean Chrétien. Mm-hmm. But he was trying to accelerate them to final agreements. He's putting the pressure on, so that it wouldn't drag out as long. What Trudeau did was he came in with a whole bunch of rhetoric about reconciliation and nation to nation and that, but he hasn't changed the policies. He's just changing the rhetoric around how he's describing our relationship.
Would you say, is the relationship between Indigenous folks any better under the Liberals than it was Conservatives?
Well, I have to say that, the $21.4 billion in new money for what I call Indian Act dependency programs is better than what Harper was giving. So I have to acknowledge that the Liberals have spent more than the Harper government. But the terms and conditions of that spending are still keeping us in a colonial situation. In fact, the way I describe it, and I've said it before, is it's a lateral move that the Trudeau government's trying to get us to do. We're under an antiquated, rusted jail cell called the Indian Act, and they want to move us into a modern jail cell, with a kitchen and a chrome toilet and all of that, but it's still a jail cell. Mm-hmm. So they want us to move, and we're still at the bottom of Confederation. We're still at the bottom of the system. As Indian Act bands, we're at the bottom, right? The provinces are telling us what to do. The feds are telling us what to do. Even adjacent municipalities are telling us what to do. So if we sign a modern self-government agreement and get out of the Indian Act, we become an ethnic government where the municipalities are still going to have more status than we do, and the province and the feds. So we're just kind of moving, like I said, from the old jail cell to the new one. And some are hoping to get a little bit more money out of it. But, I think we have to measure our lives and the future lives of our future generations with more than just cash. Money is important. We need it to live. I'm not discounting that. But the terms and conditions on how it's given to us or, how we earn it is something we need to look at. And that's why I say we need to develop our own plans. We need to do our own research and develop our own plans to come up with the best approach for our future generations. We need to think long term.
This is an amazing, amazing talk. I wish we could keep going. There's a few questions I have from people that have been following us that I'd like to just get your quick thoughts on them, if you don't mind.
No problem. Thank you.
So one of the questions we had was, you kind of covered this, so maybe you could just quickly elaborate. How are they trying to do the Rights and Terminations Act or plan? Is that through the AFN signing off? Is that the AFN not communicating to us what's going on?
In part, AFN is being used to give the impression to the public, to the media, to our people, that they're co-developing policy and legislative changes. But Trudeau's been in power from 2015 to 2019. They had the election in 2019. What he did was he made massive, unprecedented changes in my lifetime to policy, to laws, and to structure. He dissolved Indian Affairs and created 2 new departments that are facilitating the Termination Plan. And he passed laws like the Indigenous Languages Act to get federal jurisdiction into our languages. He passed the Indigenous Child and Family Services Law, which again is, maintaining the status quo, saying we have to negotiate with the provinces. And I believe the law, Bill 92, it was called, I believe you get 12 months to try and negotiate an agreement with the province. And then if you don't, you can set one up on reserve, a Child and Family Services body on reserve. But there's no money attached. So it's a hollow promise. So, but they're imposing federal jurisdiction over on us in the area of Child and Family Services. The Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples said, if you look at that report, it said there were core areas of jurisdiction where we don't need federal and provincial agreement. That's basically internal sovereignty. And Child and Family Services is one of them, the ability to raise our children and to take care of them. We can decide that. Problem is it costs money in a modern system to do that because there's liability issues in that. So that's why people haven't acted on it, they need to have some, because we've been forced on reserve and into poverty. So we don't have the kind of money to develop those kind of service systems, which our families traditionally did, right? Our extended families, the grandparents look after the children or the aunts, right? Or whoever. But our family systems have broken down because of the poverty and the theft of our land and stuff. So we really have to take a look at it in a modern situation, what's happened to us. Anyways, the termination plan, they put everything they needed in place for the first 4 years. Now they're implementing it. They're going to force final agreements to be signed. And there's basically 3 options they're giving to Indian Act bands, well, 2 for the prairies. 3 if you're in BC or Quebec. If you're in an area where you don't have a land treaty like Quebec, BC, the Atlantic, you have 3 options. Go into a modern treaty, a comprehensive claims settlement agreement. Go into a self-government agreement, and that can be either a comprehensive, like a constitution, or a sectoral agreement, like taking over education. That's a form of self-government. So modern treaty, self-government, or alternative federal legislation. You can opt out of the Indian Act into the First Nations Land Management Act, develop land codes. You can opt into the First Nations Fiscal Management Act and start developing tax systems on reserve for non-natives, but eventually it's going to come back and bite you, I would argue. So those are the 3 ways out: alternative legislation, self-government, or modern treaties. Those are your options, depending on which part of the country you're in. Or you stay under the Indian Act. And they're calling that self-determination. And they're still controlling our lands, territories, and resources. There's no restoration or restitution. So we're stuck with the existing 0.2% land base and economy, which is zero economy. So that's how the termination plan is working.
Forces into
and a lot of our chiefs, the majority of the chiefs are sitting at these tables co-opted, trying to negotiate under these self-government and land claims policies or opting into this legislation, often without talking to their people.
Yeah, I think it was Malcolm X said something along the lines of, you can't go for answers to the person that's oppressing you.
Well, that's colonialism.
Colonialism. What can Canada do to improve its relationship with Indigenous peoples?
Well, like I said, I don't think Canada will change without outside pressure. And I think that's going to have to rely on our people and any Canadians we can get to be our allies. And I think we have to go international and expose what Canada is doing to us internationally because, like I said, the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples is a non-binding declaration. But there are binding conventions, that Canada is a signatory to, like the Convention for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. So when they're discriminating against our property rights or our jurisdiction, we can go there to the Committee for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination and make complaints against Canada, or to the human rights bodies. One of the things Art was doing when he was around was he was going to the trade bodies and arguing that our Aboriginal and treaty rights constitute an unfair trade subsidy for Canada and the provinces, because the goods and services that they're selling globally don't have any compensation to us whose lands they're coming off of. Like forest products, timber, pulp. If it's coming off a treaty area, well, where's the percentage of compensation or benefit going to the treaty nation whose territory is coming off of? He was arguing that, using some of the Supreme Court decisions, saying, look, they recognize there's Aboriginal treaty rights. How come we're not getting any of this resources coming off of our territories? So he was going to trade tribunals, not just human rights or, even just the environmental bodies like the Convention for Biological Diversity. There's issues there about Indigenous peoples looking after their territories. So we have to do a lot of international work. It costs money. It's not easy. I know when Art did it, he was doing a lot of it on a volunteer basis, and he was, getting people to put him up in rooms in Geneva and that, a place to stay. But we have to do that, and we need to work at the same time on the ground, because there's no sense going to the UN and complaining unless we're doing a movement on the ground to demand that we get our rights recognized on the ground. I've always called it like a pair of pliers. You have to apply pressure internationally and apply pressure on the ground and squeeze them together. That's so you cool. Need to build a movement on the ground, but also communicating internationally.
Okay, we have just a few questions left.
Don't count on Ottawa.
Okay, I wouldn't at all. I wouldn't, yeah. What can the average Canadian who's watching this do to help?
Well, they can learn more about these issues. They could read Art Manuel's book, The Reconciliation Manifesto, or his other book, Unsettling Canada. But the Reconciliation Manifesto, I think, is a good one to talk about, because he has a 6-point plan in there to decolonize Canada. And he's talking about some of the international work that needs to be done and how Canadians can help support that. For true reconciliation, not this fake reconciliation that the Liberal government of Trudeau was pushing. So they need to learn the issues, and they need to support, legitimate Indigenous peoples in their efforts. Because, that's going to be the thing is who's real and who isn't. Because the other problem we have is all these people going around self-identifying as being Indigenous. Mm-hmm. When really they've got no connection to our nations or our people at all. And there's a lot of that fake identity stuff going around too. We need to be careful about that. The gray owl syndrome.
Yeah. The Joseph Boyden syndrome.
Some would say that. It was Jamaica Highwater was the guy on the U.S. side. He was Turkish, and he created an Indian identity. So it's been done.
Yeah, I would say that if I may add to that, is that don't look for the Indigenous person that. I think the first is to realize you're really, as a Canadian, you're super uneducated about Indigenous peoples. And even it's not really to your fault to an extent, because that's just Canada's plan for us to demonize us, to make us look like victims, to really convince the average Canadian that we don't know what's best for ourselves. So I think
Canada has a communication strategy that we call SWOT, Special Words and Tactics. And it's really to mislead the public and the media and many of our own people on what their real intentions are. It's to mask them. So you have to watch and decode what Ottawa says. Watch out for their SWOT strategy, because there's a lot of that. Like the term free education. They threw that term out. Even our own people were using it. Oh, I get free education. But that's not true. We've paid for our education services, and that really are they're obligated to provide us, because of their past treatment, the fiduciary and treaty obligations and so on. So yeah, Canadians need to know that. And there are sources, they should look around. It's hard to find, but the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples report is good to look at. The Special Parliamentary Committee on
Oh, you froze. You froze again.
Nothing has really changed since then. So the recommendations in that report are still relevant.
Oh, you froze for
And
a couple seconds.
you can look up things.
It froze for a couple
Sorry?
seconds again. It froze after the Royal Commission. You're speaking too
Yeah,
much
so
truth.
the Royal Commission on Aboriginal Peoples, you can find it online. It's hard to find print copies except maybe in libraries. I would look at that, especially Volume 1, that gives the history. Volume 2 as well gets into the self-government issues. I don't agree with everything in there, but it's a good primer.
Mm-hmm.
And, the other thing is, I was saying the Special Parliamentary Committee on Indian Self-Government called the Penner Report from 1983. Nothing has really changed since then, so those recommendations are really still relevant. And I would also say, look at our website, unsettling150.ca. We prepared a lot of materials for Canada's, so-called birthday. And there's a lot of resource materials on there, plus on my website.
Which is?
RussDiabo.com.
RussDiabo.com.
And then I don't know more, they've got stuff on their website. So if you look, you'll be able to find online resources.
Right. And don't look for the native person who validates your incomplete thoughts or uneducated thoughts about Indigenous folks. You don't look at the opportunists out there look for the ones that like Russ, people who challenge and who can really elaborate on their challenges of your thoughts.
Yeah, don't go running to a former minister of the cabinet.
Okay, so do you have? Well, the last question is, what message do you have for our people?
Well, you need to stay strong, and I think you need to network and organize. Get the correct information about what Ottawa is doing. Find out what your community is doing, like your council. Talk to your family. Talk to your community. Try and organize, teach-ins, webinars, whatever you can do to get the word out. You need to figure out what's going on, but then you need to act on it. Mm-hmm. Like I said, we need to develop self-determination plans. Part of that means we have to change our colonized thinking, under the Indian Act, and start to decolonize in our thinking, and start thinking on how we can operate independent of what Ottawa's up to, instead of thinking, well, we don't have any money, we have to do what Ottawa says to get their money. You need to think beyond that. You need to think outside the box. And, especially if you're thinking about your future generations. I'm a grandfather now, so I have to think about, the grandchildren and their children. So it's a practical thing. I'm a practical person. That's why I was arguing with you about the importance of collecting that information and, doing the mapping and stuff. Mm-hmm. These are practical tools we need to free, prior, informed consent. I always say informed means information. So if you want to practice free, prior, informed consent, get information. And when I say I don't know more, I spell it KNOW. I don't know more.
I do appreciate the correction. I think we need more Russ Diabos and less PST Pipeline Perrys.
Oh, yeah, I agree.
But yeah, that's great. I just want to say, Niao Goa, Gona Lunkwa. Yeah. And man, this is great. This will be on YouTube later, so check it out. Probably in an hour. I'll send you the link. And I really do appreciate this.
No, I appreciate you having me.
And I would say if you're watching this right now, organize in your community, pool whatever resources, gifts, a bit of money, and then send it out to Russ to come and help educate your people. And that's all I got to say, because he's an amazing gift. We need to utilize this technology we have right now, and really we have until December until they really start making some serious final movements on us.
Well, there's always things such as Skype and that, I can Skype in. Mm-hmm. That's cheap.
Yeah, no, but
it doesn't require a lot of travel.
I'm just saying, get Russ out to your place through Skype, through whatever. He's an amazing man. I just want to say, go. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay, thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Bye.